There are things a man carries with him to his grave. Not burdens, mind you, but treasures. Moments so particular, so quietly enormous, that he finds himself turning them over in his hands like smooth river stones long after the world has moved on past them. I'm an old man now, and my hands shake when the cold comes in off the mountains. But I can still feel that winter night in my bones as clear as if it were yesterday. Clearer, maybe. Some memories only sharpen with time. It was the winter of 1883, up in the high country of Colorado, where the land does not forgive a man his ignorance and the sky can turn on you between breakfast and noon. I had come over from County Galway not 3 years prior. A young man with strong shoulders, a poor accent, and less than $4 to his name. I had worked my way west by degrees, laying rail in Illinois, splitting fence posts in Nebraska, until a widower cattle rancher in Pueblo had given me honest wages for a season's honest labor. When that work dried up, I had followed a rumor of good land northwest, up into the foothills outside a small settlement that called itself, with considerable optimism, Harrow Creek. I had 47 acres of my own by then, bought cheap because the soil was rocky and the creek ran sulky in dry seasons. I had a cabin I had built with my own hands and my neighbor's ox, a small kitchen garden, 4 cattle, and one extraordinary woman who had agreed, in late September of that year, to be my wife. She was 31 years old, a widow herself, stubborn as the land she had homesteaded 4 miles east of my claim. Her first husband had left her with a deed, a debt, and a manner of getting things done that I had admired from the first day I saw her driving a wagon without any apparent help from God or man. I had courted her slowly, clumsily, the way an Irishman courts a woman who does not need courting, by showing up when things needed fixing and asking nothing in return. We had been married 8 weeks when December came down hard off the peaks. She took sick on a Tuesday. It began as a chill she dismissed, the kind of thing a capable woman waves away because she has no time for her own suffering. By Wednesday evening, she was feverish. By Thursday morning, I could hear her breathing from across the cabin, a shallow, labored sound that put the fear of God into me in a way that no winter storm ever had. I rode into Harrow Creek before first light and brought back the doctor, a precise man who carried his bag like it contained the last good judgment in the territory. He examined her in silence. When he turned to face me, his expression was measured, careful, the look of a man choosing his words for a reason. "She is very ill," he said. "We must be methodical. We must be sensible." I nodded. I intended to be both. I did not yet know how completely I would fail at that. The doctor's name was Albright, and he was a man who believed in order. He believed in measured doses, in careful observation, in the steady application of what was known and proven. He set his bag on the table by her bed, opened it with the particular click of a man who has performed this ritual 10,000 times, and began to work. Cool cloths on the forehead, a preparation he mixed from a small brown bottle into water. Instruction to keep the room warm, the stove fed, the blankets heavy. I did everything he said. I fed that stove through the night until the small cabin held a heat that would have embarrassed a July afternoon. I wrung out cloths in the basin. I sat beside her and listened to her breathe and watched the lamp throw shadows across her face, and told myself that following the instructions of a trained man was the sensible thing, the right thing, the thing a husband was supposed to do. By Friday morning, her fever was higher, not by a little, by enough that even Albright, who wore his composure like a vest he never took off, pressed his fingers to her wrist and was quiet for longer than a careful man usually needs to be. "We keep at it," he said. "The fever must break on its own. Our task is to manage it until it does." I nodded again, but something was working in me that had no name yet. She had said something to me once. We were not yet married. It was still that season of careful conversations over fence rails and supper tables. She had said that in the high country, when a draft horse ran a dangerous fever after hard summer work. Her father had packed the animal's legs in snow hauled down from the shaded north slope. She had described the way the animal's breathing slowed within an hour, the way the fever receded like water off a tilted board. Her father had learned it from an old Ute man who worked the ranch one autumn, and she had carried the knowledge the way a practical woman carries anything useful, quietly, without ceremony, waiting for the moment it might matter. I had listened to that story the way a man listens to a woman he is beginning to love, with his whole attention, storing every word without knowing why. Now I knew why. The trouble was this. What works on a horse in a summer field and what works on a woman in a winter cabin are not the same thing. Any sensible man could see that. Albright could certainly see it. When I began, slowly, to turn the idea over aloud, not yet a proposal, barely more than a question, he set down his cloth and looked at me with the full weight of his professional judgment. "That would be dangerous," he said. "That would be reckless. The shock alone could—" He stopped himself. "I'm telling you plainly, do not do that." I looked at her face. The color in her cheeks was wrong. The sound of her breathing was wrong. Everything in that room felt wrong except the memory of her voice telling me about the snow. I heard Albright. I heard every word he said, and I did not dismiss them the way a foolish man dismisses what he doesn't want to hear. He was not a bad doctor. He had ridden through 2 blizzards to reach us, and he had sat with her through the worst of the night, and his hands had been steady and his manner had been kind. He knew things I did not know. I understood all of that, and still I could not stop turning it over. She had told me the story in October, sitting on the porch steps with a tin cup of coffee, watching the first real cold come down off the high ridges. She had not told it as advice. She had told it the way people tell the things that shape them, matter-of-factly, with a kind of quiet reverence for what had worked when nothing else had. Her father's mare, 3 days of raging fever. The snow packed gently against the animal's neck and chest, replaced before it melted. The mare shivering violently at first, and then, by some mercy, growing still and breathing easier. By morning, the fever had broken clean. She had said, sometimes the body needs to be reminded what cool feels like. Sometimes it has forgotten the direction back. I had thought it was a remarkable thing to say. I had thought it sounded like her, practical and a little poetic at once, the way she sometimes was when she wasn't guarding herself. I had filed it away in the part of a man's mind where he keeps the things a woman says that he wants to remember forever. Now it was February. Now the snow outside was 3 feet deep on the flat ground, and deeper where it had drifted against the barn wall. Now she was burning, and the medicine was not breaking it, and Albright had folded his hands on his knee and stopped pretending he was certain of the outcome. I went to the door. I opened it. The cold came in like something alive. filling the room edge to edge, and I heard Albright make a sound behind me, a protest beginning, and I held up one hand without turning around. Not dismissively, just steadily. The way you hold up a hand to say, "I have heard you. I am not a reckless man. Give me a moment." The snow on the porch was clean and dry and fine-grained from the cold, the kind that doesn't pack into ice but holds its shape gently. I looked at it for a long moment. The moon was up and everything was blue-white and very still, and somewhere out past the fence line a horse shifted in the dark and blew a long breath into the cold air. I thought about her voice, the exact sound of it that October evening, the certainty in it, not the certainty of someone who is guessing, but of someone who saw a thing work with her own eyes and has never forgotten. I thought about what it would mean if I did nothing, and the fever climbed another degree by morning. Then I went inside for a clean cloth. I wrapped the cloth around my hand like a mitt, then carried a shallow basin out to the porch and filled it with snow, the same way I might fill a bucket with grain, carefully, with attention, as though the thing I was carrying mattered. It did matter. Everything mattered now, in the particular way that ordinary objects acquire weight when someone you love is in danger. The basin, the cloth, the snow, each one suddenly part of something larger than itself. She had told me, and I had listened, the way I listened to everything she said about this land, because she had lived on it far longer than I had, and because she was never careless with words, that the snow had to be clean, had to be applied gently, and could not stay in one place long enough to become a new problem. Not frost, not ice. Cold that moved, cold that drew the heat out slowly and let the body breathe. She said she had seen it done by an old woman in the valley years before I arrived, and that the old woman had learned it from her grandmother, who had crossed into Colorado from somewhere older still. A knowledge passed hand to hand, woman to woman, down through years of necessity. I carried the basin inside and set it near the foot of the bed. Dr. Albright stood by the window with his arms folded, not quite watching me, which told me he was watching me very carefully. He had the expression of a man who has made his argument and lost it, and is now waiting to document the consequences. I did not hold it against him. He was a careful man. That is not a small thing. I sat beside her on the edge of the bed and dipped the cloth in the snow, not packed, not pressed, just resting in it until the cloth was cold through, and laid it along the inside of her wrist. She did not flinch. Her breathing continued, shallow and rapid but even. I watched the hollow of her throat for a long moment. Then I moved the cloth to the inside of her elbow, then her temple, then the back of her neck, always moving, never holding the cold in one place long enough to shock the skin beneath it. Albright made a sound, not words, just a sound, low in his throat, that meant he was revising something. I did not look up. The lamp threw its small orange circle across the quilt, and beyond it, the room was all shadow and cold breath, and the faint sound of wind finding the gap under the door that I had been meaning to seal since November. I made a note to seal it. Tomorrow. Whatever tomorrow looked like, I would seal that gap. Her temperature, I could feel it through the cloth, through my palm when I rested it very lightly against her cheek, had not broken. But it had not climbed either. It was there like a wall, and I was not yet through it. But I was standing against it, and I was not moving. The doctor pulled his coat tighter and said he would stay until first light. I was grateful for that, though I did not say so. There are moments when the presence of another person, even one who disagrees with you, even one who is watching for your mistake, is itself a kind of medicine. He sat in the ladder-back chair by the window and folded his hands in his lap and said nothing more, and I continued my slow work with the cloth. I had learned the method from her the winter before last. A calf had come down with a fever that should have killed it, the kind of fever that makes the eyes go glassy and the legs uncertain. She had gone to the creek in the early morning while ice still edged the banks, and she had brought back water in the wooden bucket and worked the calf's neck and chest with a soaked rag for the better part of 3 hours, patient and methodical, humming something I did not recognize. The calf lived. I remembered watching her and thinking she was wasting her time. I remembered being wrong. Now I was the one humming, though I could not have told you what the tune was. Something without a name. Something my hands seemed to know better than my mind did. Around what I judged to be 2 in the morning, she stirred. Not much. A small movement of her head against the pillow, a slight tightening of the fingers on the quilt. But it was voluntary motion, and voluntary motion was more than I had seen in hours. I leaned closer and said her name quietly. She did not answer, but the crease between her brows, which had been pulled tight with the effort of whatever the body does when it is fighting, loosened a fraction. Albright rose from the chair without a word and came to the bedside. He pressed 2 fingers to her wrist again, then placed the back of his hand against her forehead. I watched his face. He was a man who had learned to keep his face steady, and it was steady now, but there was something in the set of his eyes. A small recalibration, the way a man adjusts his weight when the ground shifts slightly underfoot. "The same," he said. "Yes," I said, "but the same as an hour ago. Not worse." He did not argue with that. He returned to his chair. I wrung the cloth again and worked it along her collarbone, her temples, the soft inside of her wrists. The wind found the gap under the door again, and I heard it the way I had been hearing everything that night. Too loud, too close. Every sound carrying more weight than it had any right to carry. The lamp oil was getting low. I had another tin in the pantry, but I did not want to leave the room to retrieve it. I calculated how much time we had before the light began to fail, and whether I could reach the pantry and be back before she stirred again, before anything changed. I decided to wait a little longer. The lamp did not fail as quickly as I feared. It guttered once, around what I judged to be 2 in the morning, and I trimmed the wick with my thumbnail, and it settled back to a steady yellow pull. Small mercies. A man learns to count them. She had been still for nearly an hour. Not the stillness of rest. I knew that stillness, had watched her sleep 1,000 nights in that same bed. But a heavier kind. A stillness with effort behind it, as though her body had turned all its attention inward and had nothing left to spare for the surface of things. Her breathing was shallow, but even. I kept my fingers light against the inside of her wrist, not pressing, just resting there, feeling the pulse knock its small, reliable knock against my fingertips. As long as it knocked, I had something to hold. The doctor had shifted in his chair, and I could hear from his breathing that he was fighting sleep. I did not blame him. He was an old man, and it was a hard night, and he had done what he knew how to do. The rest of this was outside the boundary of what he knew, and a man who admits that boundary honestly deserves some grace. I had not been gracious to him earlier. I thought about that. Around 2:30, she moved. Not dramatically, just a small turn of her head against the pillow, a sound low in her throat that might have been discomfort or might have been something releasing. I leaned in close. Her lips were cracked and dry, and I lifted the cup from the nightstand and touched a dampened cloth to them, the way she had shown me once to do for a calf that wouldn't take the bucket. She had known things about caring for living creatures that I was still learning. I thought I always would be. The doctor was awake again. I could feel his attention on the room the way you feel weather coming. A pressure, a shift in the air. He did not speak, and I did not speak, and the silence between us had changed from earlier. It was no longer argument resting. It was something closer to waiting together, which is a different thing entirely. The cloth on her forehead had gone warm again. I replaced it. The snow packed against the outer wall had done its work earlier. I had seen it in the brief drop of her temperature when we'd applied it, the color in her face shifting from that terrible red toward something that still frightened me, but frightened me less. That small movement in the right direction was the only thing I was carrying. I wrung the fresh cloth and laid it carefully along her collarbone. She made that sound again, and this time I thought, I was not certain, but I thought there was less pain in it, less effort. I straightened and looked at the window. The darkness beyond the glass was the same deep and total dark it had been for hours. But I had begun, without meaning to think about morning. Thinking about morning was dangerous, and I knew it. A man in that situation who lets himself imagine the daylight, the relief, the exhaled breath of crisis past, that man stops watching. He relaxes a fraction before the fraction is earned. I had seen it with animals, with cattle sick through the night. The rancher who falls asleep an hour before dawn is the one who loses the animal. So I caught myself at the edge of that imagining and pulled back from it deliberately, the way you pull a horse short before a bad crossing. I got up and fed the stove. The wood caught well. I had split it fine that afternoon, before any of this began, in that ordinary world that felt now like it belonged to another year. The heat pushed out into the room, and I stood for a moment with my back to it, watching her. Her breathing had changed. I had been tracking it so long without meaning to, that I felt the change before I understood it. Earlier in the night, each breath had been a small labor, something she was working at, something that required effort you could see in the slight rise of her shoulders, the tension across her throat. Now the breaths came quieter, not shallow, quieter. There is a difference. Shallow frightens you. Quiet is something else. Quiet can be a body settling into the work of healing rather than the work of fighting. I moved back to the chair beside her and took her hand. It was still warm, too warm, but the heat had changed its quality. The dry, papery heat of the worst hours had softened. There was the faintest trace of moisture at her wrist, where I pressed 2 fingers to feel her pulse, which had steadied since midnight, though it had not yet slowed to anything I'd call reassuring. He had left his coat, the doctor. He had laid it over the back of the chair by the door when he'd come in, and in his agitation going out, he had forgotten it. It hung there now in the lamplight, a heavy, dark wool thing, and I looked at it without any feeling I could name. Not triumph, not resentment, just the coat, hanging there, belonging to a man who had done what he understood how to do, and had left when the limits of that understanding were reached. I did not blame him for leaving. I understood it, actually, better than I might have expected. There is a particular helplessness in watching something you cannot fix, and for a man trained to fix things, that helplessness lands differently. It has an edge to it. He had not left from cruelty. He had left because staying meant admitting he had run out of answers, and that was something he had not yet learned to do with any grace. I had run out of answers 3 hours ago. I was still here because there was nowhere else I belonged. She moved her hand. Not much. Just the faintest curl of her fingers against my palm. I went very still. That curl of her fingers. I do not know how to explain what it did to me. It was so small a thing. I had seen her hands do 100 difficult things. Grip a fence rail in a January gale. Wring out a cloth over a sick calf. Sign her name to papers that meant this land was hers and no one else's. Her hands were capable hands, hands that knew their own strength. But this small unconscious curl like a child reaching in sleep, it undid me in a way that none of the crisis hours before it had managed. I pressed my palm flat against hers and held it there. She did not wake. She did not speak. Her breathing was still the slow, labored thing it had been, still carrying that faint rasp at the bottom of each exhale that had been frightening me since before midnight. But the curl had been voluntary. Some part of her, some deep and navigating part, had reached outward rather than inward. That seemed to me like direction. Like will, I watched her face. The flush that had been so violent, that terrible high color that had made her look like someone painted rather than someone living. It had shifted. I could not have said, in that lamp-lit room, precisely how it had changed. The light was the same. The shadows were the same. But her face looked less like a burning thing and more like a sleeping one. Less like a fire and more like its embers. Still warm, still holding heat, but no longer consuming itself. I put the back of my wrist to her forehead the way she had once shown me, years before this night, in an offhand way that suggested she had learned it from someone older and was simply passing it along. Her skin was still warm, more than warm. But the fierce, alarming heat that had been there 2 hours ago, the heat that had made the doctor reach for his bag and begin listing the things we might try in the morning, if there was a morning in which to try them, that particular heat was different now. Lesser, not gone, but lesser. I did not let myself believe anything yet. I had learned by then that hoping too early was its own kind of danger. You spent the hope before the outcome arrived, and then if the outcome was wrong, you had nothing left with which to meet it. I had seen that happen to men on the range, men who had called a thing finished before the last count was in, and the cost of that error was a particular hollowness I did not want to carry. So I sat with what I knew, which was small, and I waited, which was what I had. Outside, the wind had eased. The snow had stopped sometime in the last hour. I was not sure exactly when, and the silence that had replaced it was the deep, unresonant silence of a world that had gone completely white. The doctor came back into the bedroom sometime after that silence settled. I heard his boots on the floorboards before I saw him. That particular careful tread of a man trying not to disturb what might be fragile. He carried the lamp he had taken to the kitchen, and the light came ahead of him like a question he was not yet sure how to ask. He set the lamp on the dresser and stood beside me. and together we looked at her. Her breathing had changed, not dramatically. This was not one of those moments from a story where a woman suddenly opens her eyes and says she is hungry. It was subtler than that. The shallow, effortful quality had given way to something that moved more freely, as though whatever had been constricting her chest had loosened a half-turn. Her color, too, still pale, still frightening in the lamplight, but the high flush across her cheekbones had gone down. The skin there was no longer stretched and burning-looking. It was simply skin. The doctor pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. He held it there a long moment. Then he moved his hand to her throat, just below the jaw, and held it there too. I watched his face as he did this. He was not a man who let much show, and I respected him for that. It was a practical quality in a doctor, same as in a man who worked cattle. But something shifted around his eyes. A particular tension that had been living there since he arrived released itself, quietly, the way a fence wire releases when you slacken the post. He straightened up. He did not say I had been right. He was not the kind of man who said that, and I did not need him to. What he said was that her temperature had come down, and that her pulse was steadier than it had been, and that we should keep her warm now. Not cold, warm. And that she would need water when she woke, and broth after that, and rest beyond that. I nodded. I could not speak just then. There was something in my throat that had been there since the doctor arrived with his bag and his grave expression, and it was only now beginning to ease its grip, and the easing of it was almost worse than the holding. He left me alone with her again. I took her hand. It was cooler in mine than it had been, cool enough that I felt it, that the difference was real and measurable, and I held it the way I had held it all those hours, with both of mine, carefully, as though the holding itself was part of whatever had turned this night around. The lamp burned steady. Outside, the white world lay still and silent, indifferent to all of it. I waited for morning. She woke near sunrise. I know the exact moment because I had been watching the window. That small square of glass he had reseated in its frame back in September, the putty still holding true, and the light was just beginning to change from black to the deep blue that comes before color returns to the world. I had not slept. I had not wanted to. I was afraid that if I closed my eyes, some fragile thing would tip the wrong direction. And so I had kept watch the way a man keeps watch over a fire in a cold barn, steady and quiet, and not asking for anything except that it continue to burn. She turned her head on the pillow. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were clear. Not the glassy, distant look they had carried through those terrible hours. Clear, present, hers. She said my name, just that. One word, quiet as a breath. I pressed her hand against my face and held it there. I did not try to speak. There was nothing I could have said that would have meant more than that silence, and I think she understood that, because she did not ask me to speak. She simply let me hold her hand against my cheek and looked at me with those clear eyes until I had gathered myself enough to pour water from the pitcher into the cup and help her drink. She took the water slowly. She asked what had happened. I told her, as plainly as I could, the fever, the long night, the snow, the doctor. I told her what she had said to me in the field that first autumn, about the mountain remedy, about the body's fire and the way cold could draw it out. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had not expected me to remember that. I told her I remembered everything she had ever told me. She looked at the window, where the light had gone from blue to pale gold, and something in her face settled the way a field settles after a long wind passes through it. Not weak, but rested. She asked about the cattle, about the hay stores, about whether the water in the near trough had frozen solid. I told her the cattle were fine, the hay was holding, and I had broken the ice at the trough before dark. She nodded as though that were simply the expected report, as though the whole night had been just another difficulty to be recorded and set aside. But her hand did not let go of mine. We stayed like that as the sun came up and filled the little room with ordinary light, the kind of light that belongs to mornings after the worst has passed, when the world looks the same as it always did, and, you know, because you were there, that it is not the same at all. It never would be again. And that was all right. That was more than all right.